Welcome to Season 1, Episode 2 of Let's Build a Startup. I'm your host and founder, Serge Torka, and in this series, we're going to build a completely open startup. That means you're going to see every phone call I make, every contract I sign, every product decision, every experiment, every piece of feedback, every employee we hire. Everything is going to be open, and hopefully that'll let us learn a little bit from each other. In the previous episode, I showed you my idea list, and we did some idea analysis. So we looked at how to analyze bad ideas, good ideas, a whole spectrum. And if you haven't seen that episode, go check it out now. But we did leave one idea off the list. And the reason we left it off is because that's the idea that we're actually going to work on. Well, that's what we're going to build for this business. And I wanted to go into full detail with this episode. So let's switch to my idea list here. This business is going to consist of two parts. So the first part is a YouTube channel that is a reality show about building a company. And that's what this is. So the reason I added this idea to my list was at the time, this was about 10 years ago, at the time, there was a lot of advice on the internet about how to run a company and how to build a company, but very little in terms of actually seeing the day-to-day work that a founder does or kind of a behind-the-scenes view. And I thought that would have been really useful, especially for myself. I was just starting out, and to see somebody with a lot more experience and how they approach things and how they think about things, I thought that would have been really useful in terms of me avoiding some of the mistakes that I've made throughout my career. And so that's what I'm hoping to build. I'm hoping to, I've had a decade of experience now building and running companies, and so I've made a lot of mistakes, and I'm hoping for the budding founder that I can help them avoid some of the mistakes that they would otherwise make. And at the same time, there are much more experienced entrepreneurs than I am. And so by making it open, if some of those folks see what I'm doing and find inconsistencies or something that could be done better, hopefully I can get some feedback and avoid some of my mistakes. The second reason that I added this is that one of the mistakes that I made in my career was not prioritizing marketing. So I was always very good at building software products, but marketing and product distribution was always this bolted on component of the business. And I really suffered long-term from doing it that way. And so with this business, we are going to make the product distribution, the letting customers know who we are and what we're doing, we're going to make that a core part of the business that is not separable from the other part of the business. The last thing I want to say about this is that personally, I've always been a poor public speaker. And by building a company this way, I'm hoping that it forces me into getting much better at that skill. You might have noticed in the previous episode, there were a ton of cuts, right? Because I can't speak that well. And so in this episode, hopefully there are fewer cuts. All right, so we're going to build an open company, but what are we going to pair it with, right? Because you need something to build. And so that's the other half of the idea. And if we scroll up here, so the original name for it was teachyour4yearold.com. I wrote this at a time when I was going through my own schooling, and as I was entering the workforce, I noticed some things about the successful people around me. The first was that a lot of them had a family focus on early education. So before they went to school, their family really emphasized learning in the house. And the second was that almost all of the successful people I know had at least one very strong role model in their life in their formative years. So it wasn't always a parent. Sometimes it was a family friend or a teacher, but there was always at least one person that they really trusted that kind of guided them through life. And so the original idea was to solve half of that problem, which is to enable parents to teach their kids and to offer a preschool education in the home without having to put in a lot of effort. Because one of the things that I also noticed is that many parents, almost every parent, wants the best thing for their kid, but many parents don't have either the skills, so maybe they're not educated themselves, and so they don't know how to steer their child in the right direction in terms of their education, or they're just not available. So some parents are working 2 jobs, 3 jobs, some parents are in jail, and so they're not able to provide that guidance for their kids. And so I wanted to build essentially a kind of a homeschooling curriculum that would allow parents to guide their children without a lot of effort. Now, since then, I've had kids of my own. So my oldest is almost 3, and I've started looking for schools for him, and I'm very surprised that I cannot find any good public schools. Now, there are some private schools that are reasonably good, but I have a moral stance against sending my kids to private school, which is that it reinforces a world where the kid has to be lucky in the parents that they're born to in order to get a great education. I think fundamentally, the world would be a better place if even very unlucky children, in terms of who they're born to or what environment they're born in, have access to great schooling. And so our scope for this idea has expanded from just a homeschooling curriculum to make it easy for parents to we want to build an entire education system that works for unlucky kids. I think we should go into the purpose. So what is the purpose of an education? And we have to have a very clear answer for that in order to know what we're trying to solve. If we don't have an answer for this, then everything else that we do on top of that, it's going to fall apart. And so my answer to what the purpose of education is that we want to provide a great model of how the world works. If kids that graduate understand how the world behaves, they will be able to make much better decisions about their life, and however they choose to define success, they'll be more likely to attain it. And the second purpose is that we want to maximize the total impact of students. Now, this is subtly different from the first one, because in theory, if everybody's making great decisions or better decisions, then we have increased the total impact. But what I want to point out here, let me switch to my tablet. So let's draw a chart. So this is wealth. Okay, this is the richest child, or born to the richest family, and this is the poorest child. So here is something that I've observed just throughout my encounters in life, is that intelligence is roughly uniformly distributed across wealth. But opportunity is very heavily correlated with wealth. And if we want to maximize the impact on the world, what we want is roughly to maximize opportunity times intelligence. Another way of looking at this is if Einstein was born 10,000 years ago in a cave, he had the same intelligence, but no opportunity. And so his impact on the world would be negligible. And so we want to maximize the opportunity times intelligence across the entire population. And roughly what the optimal way to do this is that we want to find all the very intelligent kids that are very low opportunity and make sure that they have enough opportunity to shine. So if we could magically raise the opportunity curve to look something like this, that would be a huge success. So one more thing we want to do is define our target user or our model user. In most businesses, the model user is the user that you want to attract to use your services, or somebody that's already using your services. So you're building a persona of who are you building for. In our case, the target user, we're going to define them as somebody who is just very unlucky. So we want to make sure that our school system works for somebody extremely unlucky. And if it works for them, then it'll work for anybody who's more lucky than them. And so our target user is going to be somewhere over here in this part of the chart. And we're going to say that it's somebody who is born to a family with a dad in jail and their single mom is working 2 jobs. So they have very little interaction with their parents. So given that setup, now let's talk about the problems with education. First, we want to verify that there actually is a problem. And this stat absolutely shocked me when I first read it, is that 52% of US adults are at a literacy level of grade 7 or below. So when I was in school, we were always taught that all the developed economies have literacy rates of like 98% plus. And the reason that there's such a big discrepancy between these two stats is that the way the 98% is calculated is if you can just barely read, you are considered literate for the purpose of that report. But when you dig into the numbers more, so there's this thing called the PIAAC. The PIAAC is the Program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies. So when you dig into those numbers, what the PIAAC does is it tries to answer the question of how well can somebody read. So not just can they read, but how well can they do it? And what you find is this distribution across the population. And so these first three bars here, the 4%, 14, and 34, they add up to 52, and that corresponds to a grade 7 or below level of literacy. And so that is really insane. That I could not believe that when I first read it. And I found another study that tried to gauge how expensive it is to have illiteracy. So how much more productive could the economy be if you could magically wave a wand and make everybody literate? And so if you could bump up everybody from level 0, 1, or 2, so those are the grade 7 or below level, to a level 3, which is grade 8 and above, then you would have huge impacts on those people's earning potential. For the first category, you'd almost double your salary from $34,000 to $63,000. And for the second level, you would bump your salary up by like 30%. And if you multiply that by the 130 million people that are grade 7 or below, you get just these huge numbers. So this is how much extra GDP there would be if you could wave a wand and get everybody to level 3 of literacy. So it's $2.7 trillion in GDP. And that would translate almost directly into tax revenue. So if let's say we have a 17% rate of taxation, and so that would get you $455 billion in tax revenue. So this is a huge problem and very valuable if solved. So now what are the actual problems that we want to focus on? The first one I already mentioned is that parents, even if they mean really well and they want the best for their kids, they do not always have the means to provide their kids with a great education. They might not be educated themselves, or they might not be available. So they might be in jail or working, or maybe there's domestic abuse problems. So there are all kinds of issues that come up that interfere with providing your kids an education. And even for the ones that are able, so they have the resources, the time, they have the tools to do it, it is incredibly high effort to sit down and engage with your kid and try to teach them. And so it is very tempting. I'm a new parent. I have my 2-year-old. It is very tempting to put him in front of the TV when I want some alone time. It's very, very tempting. And it's completely understandable that parents would occasionally do that. And so we want to make sure that whatever solutions we come up with will solve these problems where it's difficult for the parents to provide that education for them. The other problem is that school starts very late. So in most places it starts around 5 with kindergarten. And let's think about our model user for a second. So our model user, dad's in jail, mom works 2 jobs. And so if school starts at age 5, that means they've had 5 years of unguided exploration. And some of the habits that are not going to be great for them later in life are starting to set in. So the earlier that we start school, the better it is in terms of being able to steer those unlucky children into successful outcomes. The next problem is that great schools are expensive. So they're not available to poor people, and so our model user just does not have access to these great schools. The other problem, and this comes from over the years, I've spoken to many teachers and asked them about their opinions on this topic of what problems are there in the classroom. And one of the things that always comes up is the behavioral problems in students, right? And especially those with broken families. So the reason that behavioral problems are so toxic is that they don't only interrupt the student's behavior, the one that's having behavioral issues, but they also take away from everybody else's education because they're distracting others. The teacher now has to pay an inordinate amount of attention to that student with the behavioral issues. And so that's a really big problem in today's education system, is that we don't really handle behavioral problems. Another problem that we have with education is that we lecture the same material to every student. So let me switch to my tablet here. So let's draw another chart. So on the bottom axis, we're going to have skills, and these are individual skills, so like math, reading, writing, programming, maybe social skills, okay, etc. And then on the other axis, we're going to have proficiency. So how good is a student at those skills? And so they might be at a grade 1 level, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And so now let's look at the class average. So let's say we have a grade 2 class, and so the average of the class skill level, of the class proficiency, is going to be somewhere around, hovering around a grade 2 level. And if you're a teacher in this class, in the current system, you can't teach at the average, because that would mean 50% of the kids are going to be left behind. They're not following. And so the teacher has to aim somewhere at around the 20th percentile. So they're teaching somewhere over here. And that makes sure that everybody can keep up, or 80% of people can keep up. And this system is completely reasonable given the constraints that were there 100 years ago. So the constraints were you had very limited technology, and you had one teacher that had to manage a bunch of kids, and so you don't really have any choice but to do the same thing for all the kids. But, so as reasonable as it is, given those constraints, there are problems with this method. So let's look at an individual skill, and let's zoom in. So instead of looking at just the class average, let's look at what the distribution actually looks like. So for math, it might look like this. Okay, so there's a distribution of kids, of skill levels. And so wherever the teacher is teaching, how many kids are actually benefiting from that teaching? We have maybe, 4 kids in there that are at the skill level where the teacher is. But think about this kid over here. Are they getting anything useful from this lesson? They just don't have enough skills to keep up with what the teacher is doing. And so the longer that the teacher teaches at the average, the further behind this kid falls. And then let's think about this kid. So this one is so far ahead of the class that either whatever the teacher's teaching, they already know, or they're going to pick it up very quickly. So either the class is completely a waste of time, or in a 45-minute class, maybe it takes them 3 minutes to understand the material, and then they have 42 minutes of dead time. And so this system is very inefficient. And the reason we want to make sure that we solve for both of these kids is that this one right here, he might not be good at math, but he might be at the top of his class in reading and writing. Okay, so that's completely normal, that different kids have different abilities. And so we want to make sure that we're able to keep these kids up in terms of their basic skills so that the places where they're really good, they can really shine. And so if we can find a way to not teach to the average, if we can find a way to teach at the exact level of each student, that would be a huge improvement. So the next problem is that there is very little one-on-one time between students and teachers. And from talking to teachers over the years, what I've learned is that the things that take up the most amount of time here are lecturing and marking. And that's about 80% of a teacher's time. And lecturing includes preparing for lectures. And so, because there's little one-on-one time, we can't do this, right? We can't do this teaching to every student, because the teacher does not have enough time to sit with every student and teach them at their exact level. The next related problem is that there's also very little one-on-one time between parents and teachers. And I was actually really surprised at how low this number really is, just based on conversations with teachers. It's approximately 10 minutes per year. So that is a really low amount of time that the parent basically never meets the teacher. And the other interesting thing about this is that it actually skews those 10 minutes. It is higher for students that do well. So the students that do well, their parents are more engaged and they show up and talk to the teachers. For the students that don't do so well, whose parents actually need that one-on-one time with the teacher, their parents don't show up. And so, this is completely broken. And during that one-on-one time, the parent could be learning from the teacher about what to do with their child in terms of supplemental education. The teacher can be teaching the parent. And so we really want to, in a great school system, there would be a lot more of one-on-one time between the parent and the teacher in order to benefit that child's education. The next problem is that the curriculum moves forward even if the child is behind. So let me switch back to my tablet here. So let's say our curriculum looks like this. First, we have to learn the letters. Then we have to learn the sounds that each letter makes. Then we have to learn the maybe bigrams, so the pairs of sounds that pairs of letters, what sounds those pairs make. And then we read, let's say, 20 most common words. And so if somebody gets a 60% in understanding their letters, and then 60% in understanding the sounds that the letters make, they're just not well prepared to learn the other things that depend on that. But the curriculum has to keep moving forward. And so what ends up happening is that if you have a large gap in your knowledge early on, then the further you go, the larger that gap grows, because the dependencies that you have, the requirements, are not met. And so this really is a problem, that the curriculum moves forward even if the child is stuck on some concept that they don't understand it yet. All right, the next problem is that students are not well prepared to create value and earn money once they graduate. So we really need to build schools in such a way that once students graduate, they are well prepared to be useful and productive members of society. And the current school system maybe was okay at the time that it was designed, right, where the expected job was to be a factory worker. And so for that era, maybe it was okay. But in today's era, those skills are just no longer a good match for what's required in the world. And so we really need to make sure that schools kind of keep up with providing students useful skills that will actually translate into success in life. And the last problem I wrote down here is that teachers don't get paid very much. This is another shocking stat. I looked up the average teacher salary in the US, and it is $16.43 an hour, or about $33,000 a year. That is insanely low. So put yourself in the position. Let's say you're a brilliant engineer and you just graduated from university, and you have an offer from Google for somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000 a year, and you're choosing between that and I'm going to get another 4 years of schooling only to earn $33,000 a year. That is just, almost nobody is going to choose to become a teacher in those conditions. And so we really need a system where teachers can get paid more. So that's it for the problems that I wrote down. This is not an exhaustive list, but I think these are the big ones, where if all of these were solved perfectly, then I think we could get this 52% down to 0. And so now let's look at solutions. So these are things that would contribute to solving some of these problems. So the first thing you do is that the curriculum has to be completely digitized, and it has to be individual. It cannot be a curriculum where every student is at the same place at the same time. Every student is on their own path. They have a different set of skills, and so they develop at different speeds, and different skills at different speeds, even within the same student. And so it has to be that it's an individual curriculum that follows each student independently. And in order to have this individualized curriculum, you cannot have the teacher be lecturing at the front of the class, because that means that the entire class is paying attention to them. And so by definition, they are moving at the same speed. So we have to replace the lecturing with something, and that's videos. And this idea is shamelessly stolen from Khan Academy. If you haven't seen the Khan Academy pitch at the TED Talk from about a decade ago, I really recommend that you see it. It's in the description down below. I think everybody would benefit from watching that talk if you haven't seen it already. But the idea is that we replace all the lectures with videos, and so that way kids can move forward with the content to learn at their own pace. So if we go back to my tablet here, we can achieve this here, where the same kid is at a grade 5 level in reading and at a grade 1 level in math. And the other thing that this solves is that we remove, right, we have this problem that we have very little one-on-one time between students and teachers. And now we are removing all of the lecturing responsibility away from the teacher, and it's going to be done with videos. And videos are actually even more beneficial for the kids because they can pause and rewind and replay the specific section of video where they don't understand something. And so this is a huge win in all dimensions. One note here, though, is that the curriculum cannot be fully online, like an e-school or something like that. And I've thought about ways to do it, but there are just some fundamental things that cannot be done online. And that's mainly social development. So in order to develop social skills, you really need the physical presence. And so you have to have a real building that the students gather in. The next thing that we want to solve is that school should start as early as possible. Remember, one of the problems is that school starts late. And so our model user, whose dad is in jail and whose mom is working 2 jobs, they have bad habits setting in. And so we want to interfere as soon as possible to break those bad habits. And so at age 2, they still haven't had time to set. And if you place a good role model in that student's life, they will have a chance to guide them through those formative years. The next solution is that teachers must not lecture or mark. We've already spoken about lectures, so that's going to be replaced by videos. And now let's talk about marking. So for marking, it is very important that we have the curriculum fully digitized. If it's digitized, then we can use a computer to do the marking. And this was already possible, let's say 20 years ago, for subjects like math and science, where there's one correct answer and you just need to write down the answer. But for things like reading comprehension, you tell a story and then you ask something about one of the characters, that was not possible until about 2 years ago. And I think with the current iteration of large language models and AI, it is now possible to grade every subject with no involvement from the teacher. And so if we are able to get the teacher to not lecture or mark, that frees up 6 hours a day for that teacher to do one-on-ones with the kids. And just to give you a sense of how huge those numbers are, 6 hours, so we're assuming a class of 20 kids, and that is 20 minutes per child one-on-one. And this is where previously we were doing like 20 minutes per month per child. So this is a huge increase in the amount of one-on-one time that the teacher has with the child. And if we go back to my chart here, we can see why this is very important, is that the teacher can adapt their teaching to the student. And the other thing that we can do is we can actually, instead of doing one-on-one, we can do two-on-one. And if we do two-on-ones, then every child gets 40 minutes per day. And the reason you can do two-on-ones is because you can group the kids together, right? Like if you group 2 kids with similar skills together, if the teacher teaches at the midpoint of that, both of those kids are still very close to their optimal learning rate. And so they're going to be moving along as quickly as they can. It's just if you have a full class with a large distribution, that's when it doesn't work. But two-on-one would be almost as effective as one-on-one, but it would give kids 40 minutes with their teacher per day. Every day. Not just one day, every day. And so this is a massive, massive improvement Another solution that was very recently unlocked is that for $70 on Amazon, you can get this laptop. All right, it's called the Acer 511 Spin, used, $70 on Amazon. It can fold into a tablet. It has a keyboard, it has a touch screen, and it has a stylus. And so because of the touchscreen and the stylus, you can use it for very early education where kids do not yet know how to type. They don't yet understand letters, but they do understand touch, and they maybe understand how to hold a pencil. And you can watch the videos on here. You can also do the automated grading with the AI. And 10 years ago, a laptop like this would have cost $2,000. So for a classroom of 20 kids, that's a replacement cost if you're replacing every laptop every year, just because damage or stolen or whatever. So that would cost you $40,000 per year to replace the class's laptops. And $40,000 per class per year is just not even close to being possible. At $70 per laptop, your replacement cost is now $1,400 per year. So it's way, way, way cheaper and easily affordable. So you can do this, and for every kid, you can have a new laptop or a new used laptop every year. All right, the next cool thing that you can do is you can build an automated YouTube channel that's individualized to each student based on their curriculum. So because if the curriculum is entirely digital, we know exactly where each student is on this skill chart. And so we can build a YouTube channel that just splices all these videos together. And if you're a parent that's tired or you don't feel so engaged that night, you can put them in front of the TV and they'll continue learning, and the learning will be targeted at exactly where they need to be given their curriculum. All right, the next solution is to pay the parents when their kids do well. And some of you are thinking like, what? You can't pay the parents? And let me show you why you need to pay the parents. So this is the student's skill graph. And the way it'll work is that every time a student completes a skill, so let's say they achieve mastery over the letters, they know what every letter is, then we'll put a $2 bill or $2 into a piggy bank. And now they master the sounds that each letter makes. We put another $2 in the piggy bank. And so for the whole month, every time they complete a skill, we put $2 in the piggy bank, and we'll calibrate. It's not necessarily going to be exactly $2, but we'll calibrate it so that at the end of the month, it's about $50 in the piggy bank. And now what we do is that in order for the parent to collect their payment, they have to show up to a 30-minute one-on-one with the teacher. And the reason we have to pay them to show up to that one-on-one is because of our model user. Remember, the model user, their dad is in jail and their mom is working 2 jobs. So in order for the mom to take time off her work to come in to do the parent-teacher one-on-one, you have to pay her, because otherwise she's not going to come because she'll miss rent. So you absolutely have to pay her to show up. And now, when she shows up, those 30 minutes are spent by showing the parent how to work with their kid for the next month. So you're discussing the progress and what to do at home to give that parent the tools in order to supplement the kid's education at home. So we're solving multiple problems at once here, is that the parent is given the tools through the one-on-one, and because they're paid for the results, they have an incentive to follow through on what was said with the teacher. And this payment, it's not huge. It's $50 a month. And so for the kids, for the rich kids in the class, it's not going to make a huge difference. But for those kids, we don't really care, because those kids are going to do well anyways, because their parents already know the value of an education and how to supplement it at home. And so we really want to target the parents that don't have the ability to teach their kids. The next solution is to change the role of the teacher. The way it works today is that I have the same teacher for 1 year, and at the end of the year, I never talk to that teacher again. And so there's a very weak bond created between the student and the teacher. The student does not trust the teacher, and the student definitely does not look up to the teacher as a role model in their life. And so when they get to an age where behavioral problems start being a problem, the only fear that that student has is getting in trouble. What we want to do is make it so that the reason they don't misbehave is because they're afraid of disappointing somebody that they trust. And so we're going to change the teacher's role to be a lifelong mentor. So when you first come to school at age 2, you're going to meet your teacher, and you're going to have the same teacher for the next 12 years of your life. And so by the time you're at age 7 or 8, you've already known this person in your life for almost your whole life, for as long as you can remember, and they are a trusted figure. And they're going to serve to be the role model in your life that guides you. The other cool thing that comes out of a mentor model is that the teaching is going to get way more efficient. When a teacher has only known a student for 6 months, they're not going to have a very good understanding of how that student learns. But when the teacher has known that student since they were in diapers, they've known them for the last 8 years, they're going to know exactly how best to motivate that student to learn. This one I already spoke about, but the goal is that every student has to have at least one great role model in their life, and we're aiming for the teacher to be that role model. And they might have other great role models, so they might have great parents, and those are great role models for them, but we have to have at least one. The next solution is that the curriculum requires full mastery. We've already spoken about this a little bit, but the idea is that you cannot move on to learn new skills until you've mastered all the prerequisite skills required. And so that way you do not develop these Swiss cheese holes in your knowledge as you move forward. Now, a consequence of requiring 100% in every skill before moving on is that grades are very, very fluid. So the same student can be in grade 6 at math while being in grade 1 at reading. So the whole concept of grades kind of goes away. It's more of a skill curve rather than a grade. The next problem that we're going to tackle is we want to make sure that students are productive and useful members of society when they graduate. And the way we're going to tackle this is that we're going to teach entrepreneurship from a very young age. Now, the goal of this is not to make every child an entrepreneur when they grow up. The point is to show them and help them understand the inner workings of a business, because that is just the way that society runs, is it runs on companies. And so we want them to have a very good understanding of how companies behave and how they run so that they can best find their role in society. And one of the requirements might be to build a small business. So one of the skills in your skill tree will be to build a small business that earns a certain threshold of income, not a huge amount, but to just understand the basics of building a business. And what that allows them to do when they go out in the workforce is it allows them to negotiate and find where they can create the most value, and they always have a fallback option if they fail to do that. Now, the way that we would embed entrepreneurship into the school system is that either in the same school building or somewhere nearby, we would build a startup hub or a business center. And every week, there would be leaders from those startups or from those businesses, or even from the nearby community, coming in to talk to the kids in the class. And the goal here would be, first of all, that we expose kids to leaders, because that is one way that opportunity arises. The second thing is that we would expose those kids to the energy that those leaders bring, right? Successful people, they are really energetic. They have a lot to say. They have a lot of opinions. And so we want to expose kids to that energy because we want them to see how successful people behave so that they can imitate them and become successful themselves. And so one of the ideas I had, for example, was to do a pitch competition for 5-year-olds. So startup founders would come in to a class of 5-year-olds and they would pitch their product. One of the hardest things about a pitch is to make it digestible for somebody that doesn't quite have all the required background knowledge. And so in the limit, what that looks like is pitching to a 5-year-old. And this would be very beneficial to the founder because they'd get brutal feedback on where their pitch works and where it doesn't. And it would also be very beneficial to the 5-year-olds because they would see how a founder does what they do. They would see repeated iterations of the pitch getting better, right? They come in 1 week and they see a certain pitch, and then they come in the next week and they see a better pitch, and then they see it the next week and they see a better pitch, and they see this pattern of failure and failure and failure, and then eventual success. And so we really want to expose kids to that, try again until you succeed. All right, and the last solution is to cover this point, is that teachers don't get paid very much. And so we need to allocate a higher proportion of budget to paying teachers. We need to make sure that it is competitive. If I have a choice between Google and being a teacher, it's a toss-up. It's a coin flip. We need to get very good teachers to want to become teachers. So back to our problems, we want to make sure that we've covered all of the problems with at least one of the solutions. So the first one is that parents may not have the possibility to supplement education. We've covered that in two ways. First is the automated YouTube channel where a parent can just plop down their kid in front of the TV and they'll get valuable educational content. And so their kid is continuing to learn. And the second is the one-on-ones. So every month the parent goes in for 30 minutes and does a one-on-one with the teacher so that they can understand how to teach their child better. And those solutions also go for the second one where it's just a lot of effort. And so the YouTube channel solves that problem. We've solved this because we're starting school at age 2. We have not solved this one. So I think if we did this, we would have a great school, but we have not spoken about finances yet. And the finances will be covered in the next episode. So in this episode, we just want to talk about the ideas of what an ideal school looks like. And then in the next episode, we're going to worry about how to fit that into a business model where the students don't have to pay. And so we'll talk about that for the next episode. The behavioral problems are solved by the mentorship model. So the mentor will both be a trusted role model. And so there will be fewer behavioral problems to begin with. And because they're a lifelong mentor, they will have lots of experience with that child. And so when behavioral problems occur, they will be much better able to deal with them. Lecturing the same material to every student. This is solved by the individualized curriculum and by the heavy reliance on one-on-one time in the new model. Not enough one-on-one time. Again, this is solved by moving all the lectures to video and doing all the marking with AI. Very little one-on-one time between parents and teachers. This is solved by doing 30 minutes of one-on-one time per month. So this is 30 minutes per day with one parent. So if you have a class of 20, there are 20 weekdays per month at least. And so every day the teacher meets with a different parent, and we get 30 minutes per month with each parent. And we pay them so that the parent has an incentive to come, and so they'll show up. The curriculum moving forward, even if the child is behind, no longer happens because the curriculum is individualized and you do not move on until you've mastered the required skills. The students are not well prepared to create value. This is covered by the entrepreneurship. So we will teach students how to make money as part of the school curriculum and finances and all that. And teachers don't get paid very much. We just said allocate a higher proportion of budget to paying teachers. But again, this is a finance question, and so we will cover this more on the next episode. So we have what I think is a great idea, and if we could wave a magic wand and implement all these solutions, I think this would be a drastic improvement to literacy rates. And so now we have some other questions. First of all, why me and why this idea? So teaching is in my blood. Both of my parents were teachers. 2 of my grandparents were also teachers. My grandpa was a principal and a math teacher, and my grandpa would actually invite kids from the street to teach them math, outside of school. And so, my grandma described it as like you're bringing all the kids with dirty feet and messing up the living room just to teach them math. And so I really feel like teaching is a passion of mine, and I've been around teachers all of my life, and I think I could do a much better job, given that background, than the average entrepreneur. I also have deep software and product expertise just from my years of building software products. And so I understand technology very deeply, and I understand how technology can solve some of these problems in a way that somebody who just has a teaching background would not understand. I also have young kids at the age level that I'm targeting. So we're targeting early childhood education, and I have a partially selfish goal of providing great public school for my own 2-year-old. And so there is an enormous amount of incentive to get it right. And so even though a lot of assumptions here might be incorrect, I think directionally they are very correct. And as long as we iterate and we figure out where we're wrong and fix those things, I just have a huge level of motivation to do that correctly. And the other thing that I'm willing to do that other folks might not be is I'm willing to live in a low education neighborhood to test this out. Because you want to be very close to your customers. When you're building a product, it's very important to see with your own eyes and get feedback as quickly as possible. And most people that are in my position where I am comfortable enough that I could retire and not work another day in my life, most people in my position would not be willing to live in a low education neighborhood, because that comes with all sorts of problems. And I am. Okay? And so that's why I think I'm a good fit for this specific problem. Let's talk about risks. So first of all, there is a huge difference between the current school model and the model that I'm proposing. And when you have a large change, there are entrenched interests that don't want that change. And so what I'm expecting is that we will likely face resistance in bringing this model about. And we'll talk about specific strategies in a future episode. Another risk is that in our mentorship model, the same teacher is with the same students for 12 years in a row. And so what happens if a mentor leaves, or if they die, or if we hire the wrong person and they're not a good role model? We need to somehow make the system more redundant so that if something happens to one of the mentors, the students are not left stranded. And so one idea that comes off the top of my head is that instead of having a classroom where you have 20 kids and one teacher, you have a classroom with 60 kids and 3 teachers. And so that way, even if something happens to one of the mentors, there is redundancy built in where you have multiple role models in your life. And even if the one that you were closest to, something happens to them, you have other backups available. Another risk is that the current education system is a very large system with lots of moving parts. I don't understand anywhere close to the entire system, and there is lots of momentum in the existing way of doing things. And so what that means is it might take forever to make useful changes. Another risk is that it might be difficult to attract private capital. We'll talk about this more in the next episode when we explore business models, but we really want to make sure that private capital is interested in pursuing the solution to this problem, because that can speed up the solution tremendously. So we really want to be able to attract investors. And finally, the success of some AI companies recently makes it so that every business is at risk of AI taking over and doing a better job than they can. And I think early childhood education, I think there's something hardwired in babies' brains to make it so that they need humans. And so this will be one of the last places where AI fully takes over. And we actually might be able to use AI ourselves to make this model even more efficient. The next thing I want to cover is what wild success looks like. So if we were to, again, wave a magic wand and everything goes perfectly and it's perfectly executed, what we would have is that 95% of 14-year-olds are at level 4+ on that PIAAC literacy scale. We would have a double-digit increase in GDP just from the education system. The amount of opportunity offered to poor people would be way higher, and the amount of social mobility would increase dramatically. And as a result of that, the racial tensions that we've seen increasing over the last decade would dramatically decrease. One thing that I've observed, no matter where you sit on this issue, is that many of the solutions being offered are aimed at the symptoms rather than at the cause. No matter how you stratify crime, whether it's by race or by poverty, the root cause is a lack of access for kids to great education. And so if we can solve that problem, we will solve a lot of the problems that are dividing society. So that's it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please hit the subscribe button below. And on the next episode, we're going to drill into the finances. So we're going to try to package all of those ideas that we had as solutions and put them together into a profitable business model that can attract private capital to help solve this problem. I'll see you next time on Let's Build a Startup.